The question, is there life after theory, became important in literary studies around the early 2000s. A major conference in the UK in 2003 explored this issue, and its published volume suggested that theory had not disappeared but had entered a new phase. Even earlier in the 1990s, many scholars were already saying that the main period of literary theory was over. Writers like Terry Eagleton and others used titles like After Theory, implying that theory had finished its major work. Some critics even welcomed this, believing that theory had disrupted traditional literary criticism and now needed to be cleaned up or corrected. However, saying that theory is over does not mean that it has disappeared. Instead, it means that theory is no longer new or shocking. Many of its ideas have now become common and widely accepted. These ideas have blended into everyday thinking, shaping how we understand literature, identity, and language. One major idea that has become widely accepted is that identity is not fixed. Earlier, people believed that identity, such as being British, female, or religious, was stable and unchanging. Now, it is understood as flexible and constantly changing. Identity is shaped by social, cultural, and personal influences, and it can shift over time. In simple terms, who we are is always in the process of becoming. Similarly, our understanding of literary text has changed. A text is no longer seen as having a single fixed meaning. Instead, its meaning can change depending on the reader, context, and time period. Even famous writers like William Shakespeare are interpreted in many different ways through political, feminist, post colonial, or religious perspectives. This shows that texts are not stable, they have multiple meanings and can be understood differently by different groups. Another important idea is that language itself is unstable. Words do not always have clear or fixed meanings. Language can be ambiguous, full of metaphor, and open to different interpretations. Influenced by thinkers like Freud, we now recognize that slips of the tongue, hidden meanings, and unconscious influences are part of how language works. This makes communication more complex and less certain than previously thought. There is a growing awareness that all knowledge and opinions are uncertain. We cannot claim absolute truth because every viewpoint depends on perspective and context. Our ideas are provisional and open to change. This means that taking a position always involves interpretation and cannot be completely objective. In addition to these core ideas, theory itself has changed in several ways. First, it has become more practical and evidence based. Earlier, theory often made large abstract claims without much proof. Now, there is a greater emphasis on clear arguments and careful analysis. Scholars are expected to explain their ideas more clearly and support them with evidence. Second, theory has moved away from very large and abstract frameworks. For example, instead of focusing on broad ideas like ideology or politics, scholars now study specific historical periods and cultural contexts in detail. This makes theory more focused and grounded. Third, there has been a shift away from the idea that language controls everything. Some earlier theorists suggested that reality is entirely shaped by language. Critics like Christopher Norris have challenged this, arguing that there is a real world outside language and we are responsible for our statements. Another noticeable change is a renewed interest in religion and spirituality in literary studies. Scholars are once again exploring religious themes and ideas which had been less important during the height of materialist theory. Recent global crises such as terrorism, war, and environmental problems have influenced theory. thinkers like Terry Eagleton have focused more on issues like violence, morality, and ethics. This kind of writing reflects a sense that the world is facing serious challenges and literary criticism must respond to them. Theory has not ended. Instead, it has changed and adapted. It is no longer a dramatic or revolutionary movement, but a set of ideas that shape how we think. Theory continues to develop, taking new directions while remaining an important part of intellectual life. Presentism is a way of reading literature that focuses on what a text means today, rather than trying to understand only what it meant in the past. As defined by Hugh Grady, presentism is concerned with the text's meaning in the present, while older approaches like historicism focus mainly on past meanings. Presentism was mainly used to study early modern literature, especially the works of William Shakespeare. Later, it also became important in the study of Romantic literature, where it is often called critical presentism. Important scholars who support this approach include Terence Hawkes, Hugh Grady, and Ivan Ferny. Presentism developed as a reaction against historicist approaches such as New Historicism and cultural materialism, which became popular in the 1980s. These approaches were strongly influenced by thinkers like Michel Foucault and Raymond Williams. They believed that literature must be studied within its exact historical context. For example, Foucault argued that we must understand a text by carefully placing it in its specific time and conditions. Similarly, Williams emphasized understanding the whole social process in which a text was produced. Because of this, literary studies became heavily focused on historical research. Many scholars believed that only by studying history in detail could literature be properly understood. By the late 1990s, this view had become so dominant that ignoring history seemed unprofessional. Presentism challenges this idea. It argues that we can never fully and truly recover the past as it was. According to Terence Hawkes, it is impossible to fully recreate or experience the past because our understanding is always shaped by present day concerns. This idea is supported by Benedetto Croce, who said that all history is contemporary history, meaning that we always interpret the past through the lens of the present. Unlike historicists who try to speak with the dead by reconstructing the past, presentists aim to speak with the living. They actively look for connections between past texts and present concerns. For them, literature matters because it speaks to issues that are relevant today. For example, Ivan Ferny argues that Shakespeare is more relevant now than ever because his works are widely read, performed, and studied across the world. This makes him a contemporary writer in a practical sense, even though he lived centuries ago. Presentism also questions the idea that we can step outside our own historical position. If our identities are shaped by our time, then we cannot fully understand a completely different historical period. This creates a problem for historicism, which claims to reconstruct the past objectively. Another important aspect of presentism is its focus on current social and political issues. For instance, Hawkes connects Shakespeare's plays to modern political developments like devolution in the United Kingdom, where Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland gain separate political powers. By doing this, he shows how old texts can help us think about present day problems. Presentism also challenges traditional hierarchies. It suggests that the present is just as important as the past, and that performance, how a play is acted today, is as important as meaning, that is, what the text originally said. It even argues that the influence of writers like William Shakespeare on thinkers such as Karl Marx and Freud is just as important as applying Marxist or Freudian theories to Shakespeare. In simple terms, presentism is a method that starts with the present and uses it to interpret the past. It openly accepts that our readings are shaped by modern concerns and uses this as a strength rather than a weakness. Instead of trying to fully recover the past, presentism focuses on how literature continues to speak to us today. In practice, presentism focuses on how a literary text connects with the current concerns, rather than only its original historical context. A key idea is that our present understanding shapes how we interpret the past. In simple terms, the ending, our present, influences how we see the beginning, the past. For example, Terence Hawkes reads Hamlet as a play about surveillance and control. He begins with a modern and recent snapshot, such as how Hamlet was approved by American forces in post World War II Berlin because it deals with justice and corruption. This links the play to modern systems of power and monitoring. Presentist criticism often builds a kind of story or plot around the text, mixing literary analysis with real life examples. Hawks even connects Hamlet to the life of an actor who had to hide his identity during Nazi rule, showing how themes like acting and disguise exist both in the play and real life. This method includes close reading of the text, but always around strong themes like power, identity, or politics. Presentism and historicism mainly differ in their choice of context. One focuses on the past, while the other focuses on the present. Transversal poetics is a modern American approach to literature that developed in the late 1990s. It is quite similar to British presentism because both connect old texts with present day issues. However, transversal poetics goes further by making bold and sometimes surprising links between early modern works like Shakespeare's plays and modern culture, politics, and society. The main idea is to read text transversely, which means going beyond normal boundaries and making unconventional or even transgressive connections. This approach tries to uncover hidden or ignored meanings in text and use them to challenge systems of power, especially state authority. It believes literature can have a real social and political impact. The key figure behind this theory is Brian Reynolds, along with scholars like Donald Hedrick and William West. Reynolds argues that in early modern England, the state had strong control over society, but theatre acted as a space of resistance. For him, theatre is not just about individual plays but a powerful space where ideas can challenge authority. He describes it as a place linked to what society often rejects, things like disorder, rebellion, and the unknown. An important method in transversal poetics is called fugitive exploration. This means creating interpretations that break free from traditional or limited readings of texts. These interpretations aim to be creative, socially aware, and politically meaningful. For example, Reynolds connects the witches in Macbeth to modern situations like advertising or legal manipulation. The witches make misleading promises, just like modern advertisements or persuasive language in courtrooms or religion. This kind of comparison shows how old texts can reflect patterns that still exist today. Transversal poetics also differs from deconstruction. While deconstruction focuses on the instability of language and meaning, transversal poetics moves beyond this and tries to connect text directly to real world issues. It is more politically active and socially engaged. Transversal poetics encourages readers to link literature to their own lives and current problems. It is bold, creative, and sometimes complex, but its main goal is to make literary study more meaningful and relevant to the present world. New aestheticism is a modern approach in literary theory that began to develop in the 1990s and became more clearly defined around the year 2000. It focuses on the unique qualities of a literary text and tries to engage with it in a meaningful way, rather than trying to control or explain away its meaning using theory. Important scholars connected with this movement include Isobel Armstrong, John Johin, and Simon Malpass. Their work challenges the dominant trends in literary theory that had been popular since the 1970s. For many years, most critical approaches like Marxism, psychoanalysis, and post structuralism tended to reduce literature to something else. For example, Marxist critics saw literature mainly as a product of social and economic forces. Psychoanalytic critics treated it as an expression of unconscious desires. Post structuralists argued that literature simply shows how unstable language is. In all these approaches, literature itself was not trusted. Critics believed that texts were hiding deeper meanings, and their job was to uncover these hidden truths. This method of interpretation is what Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion. It assumes that the surface meaning of a text is misleading and must be exposed. For many decades, critics acted like detectives, trying to unmask literature and reveal its hidden ideological messages. As a result, literature lost its independence and uniqueness. Every text was treated as guilty of something: sexism, racism, class bias, or other ideological problems. New aestheticism reacts strongly against this attitude. It argues that not all literary works are the same and they should not be judged using the same theoretical framework. Just as we respect differences between cultures and individuals, we should also respect the individuality of each literary text. Instead of assuming that texts are always hiding something, new aestheticism encourages us to listen to what the text is doing and saying. This does not mean returning to old fashioned close reading in a simple way. Instead, new aestheticism is influenced by philosophical ideas from thinkers like Kant and Hegel, whose ideas about art and aesthetics are re examined in a modern context. It also recognizes that all interpretations are part of an ongoing process. No reading is final or complete. At the same time, new aestheticism has some similarities with the 19th century aesthetic movement associated with figures like Oscar Wilde, which promoted the idea of art for art's sake. This idea emphasized that art should be valued for its beauty and creativity, not just for its moral or social usefulness. However, new aestheticism is not simply a return to this older view. It combines aesthetic appreciation with modern critical awareness. A key example of new aestheticism in practice is the radical aesthetic by Isabel Armstrong. In this book, Armstrong challenges earlier critics like Eagleton, who argued that aesthetic pleasure is closely tied to ideology and social power. To understand the difference, consider a poem written in the form of a sonnet. Traditional suspicious critics might argue that the beauty of the poem, its rhyme, structure, and clever language, is actually a sign of social privilege. They might say that such artistic skill reinforces class divisions and hides real social conflicts. New aestheticism, however, looks at these same features differently. It sees them as sources of intellectual and emotional pleasure. The way a sonnet develops its ideas, creates tension, and resolves it in the final lines is not just ideological, it is also an artistic achievement that affects the reader deeply. Armstrong's reading of Tintin Abbey by William Wordsworth shows how this approach works. Instead of trying to master the poem by analyzing it from a distance, she suggests getting closer to its emotional impact, or what she calls its affect. Earlier critics often avoided emotional responses, seeing them as unscientific or subjective. Armstrong argues that these feelings are actually an important part of how literature works. She even examines very small details, such as a single word like off, to show how meaning is created. This kind of ultra close reading goes beyond traditional methods by focusing not just on big ideas but also on tiny elements of language. Armstrong also uses ideas like bifurcation and erasure. Bifurcation means that when a poem chooses one idea, it still keeps other possibilities in mind. Erasure refers to the way texts rewrite or revise themselves. For example, Wordsworth often corrects or changes his descriptions within the poem, creating a sense of uncertainty. This shows that the poem is not fixed or complete, it is still thinking and exploring. In this way, new aestheticism sees literature as dynamic and alive, not as a static object. A text is not something to be solved or explained once and for all. Instead, it is something that invites us into an ongoing conversation. Another important idea comes from the book The New Aestheticism, edited by John Johin and Simon Malpass. They argue that great literary works survive over time not because they have single timeless meaning, but because they allow for multiple interpretations. They leave space for readers to respond, question, and engage. This means that literature is not about giving clear answers, instead, it is about keeping questions open. For example, we cannot definitively say whether Heart of Darkness by Conrad is racist or not, or whether Hamlet is truly mad. These questions do not have final answers, but discussing them can lead to deeper understanding. New aestheticism values this open ended discussion. It sees reading as a dialogue between the reader and the text rather than a one sided act of interpretation. This dialogue is never finished. It continues as long as readers engage with the text. In contrast to earlier theories that gave power mainly to the critic, new aestheticism gives more importance to the text itself and the reader's experience. It encourages a more democratic approach where meaning is created through interaction rather than imposed from above. New aestheticism is about rediscovering the richness and complexity of literature. It moves away from suspicion and control and instead promotes engagement, openness, and dialogue. Literature is seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a living conversation that continues to evolve with each new reading. Historical formalism is a recent approach in literary studies that tries to balance two important aspects: form, that is, how a text is written, and history, the context in which it was produced. It emerged as a named idea around 2003 at a meeting of the Shakespeare Association of America and was later developed in works like Shakespeare and Historical Formalism, edited by Stephen Cohen. To understand this approach, it helps to know that literary studies have often moved back and forth between focusing on form and focusing on history. In the 1980s, movements like New Historicism strongly emphasized historical context. They studied how literature is shaped by its time, culture, and politics. However, they paid less attention to literary forms such as genre, structure, and style. Historical formalism tries to correct this imbalance. It does not reject history, but it adds more focus on how a text creates meaning, not just what it means. For example, instead of only asking what a play like Macbeth says about its historical period, historical formalism also asks how its form, such as being a tragedy, its structure, and its language, produces meaning and effects. This approach pays special attention to genres such as sonnets, comedies, or tragedies. It studies how these forms developed over time and how they influence the way a text communicates ideas. In this sense, it combines historical awareness with formal analysis. However, historical formalism is not a complete break from earlier theories like New Historicism. It is more of a course correction. It adjusts the focus slightly rather than creating a totally new direction. It still values historical context but tries to include the importance of form. Historical formalism is a balanced approach that brings together form and history. While it is not as radical as approaches like presentism or new aestheticism, it offers a useful way to rethink how literature works by paying attention to both its structure and its historical background. Cognitive poetics is a modern approach to reading literature that combines ideas from linguistics, the study of language, and psychology, the study of the mind. Its main aim is to understand how our minds work when we read literature. Instead of focusing only on meaning, history, or ideology, cognitive poetics asks what happens in the reader's mind while reading a text. Some important scholars in this field include Reuven Suhr, Peter Stockwell, Alan Richardson, Joseph Tabby, and Ellen Spolsky. The word cognitive comes from the Latin word cognoscere, which means to know. So, cognition refers to how we gain knowledge through thinking, experience, and our senses. Cognitive science studies how the mind works, how we think, understand, imagine, and remember. This approach developed partly because of a major change in thinking about the mind during the 1950s. Earlier psychologists like Skinner believed that human behavior, including language, was learned mainly through external factors like rewards and punishments. But this view was challenged by Chomsky, who argued that human beings are born with an innate ability to learn language. According to Chomsky, language is not just learned from outside, it is also built into the human brain. This idea helped bring back the importance of nature, what we are born with, which earlier theories had often ignored. It also encouraged scholars to study how language and thought are connected. Since literature uses language in complex ways, it became natural to apply cognitive science to literary studies. In the early 1990s, scholars like Sur and Ellen Spolsky began to develop this combined approach, leading to the growth of cognitive poetics. A key moment came in the 1998 when the Modern Language Association held discussions on literature and cognitive science, helping to establish this field. Cognitive poetics can be used in two main ways. First, it can focus on the content of a literary work, what it says about the mind. For example, Alan Richardson analyzes Persuasion by Jane Austen to explore how the novel presents ideas about the mind and human behavior. In Austen's time, many people believed that the mind was shaped entirely by experience and environment. This idea came from philosophers like John Locke, who described the mind as a blank slate, tabula rasa. According to this view, people become who they are because of their upbringing and social conditions. Richardson shows that Austen's novel offers a more balanced view. Her character, Anne Elliot, is shaped both by her experiences such as loss and disappointment and by her inner emotional and physical responses. For instance, when Anne feels strong emotions, her body reacts, her heart beats faster, her face changes color. This shows that the mind is not separate from the body, it is embodied, meaning that thinking and feeling are connected to the physical processes. Another character, Louisa Musgrove, suffers a head injury that changes her personality. This suggests that physical changes in the brain can affect the mind. In this way, the novel reflects ideas similar to modern cognitive science that human behavior is shaped by both internal and external factors. The second and more common approach in cognitive poetics focuses on how readers process a text mentally. It studies how language directs our attention and shapes our understanding. For example, cognitive critics often use the concepts of figure and ground. The figure is what we focus on, while the ground is the background. When we read a sentence like the ship moved away from the shore, our attention is drawn to the ship, that is the figure, while the shore becomes the background, the ground. As a text develops, this focus can shift. A ship can become the background when attention moves to a person on the ship, then to an object in that person's hand, and so on. This constant shifting of attention is part of how our minds process a story. Another important idea is that certain features of language can attract attention. For example, unusual word order or unexpected phrases can make us pause and think more deeply. If a sentence includes a phrase like as if unconsciously in an unusual position, it may suggest hidden meanings or create doubt about what is happening. This shows how language can guide our thoughts in subtle ways. Cognitive poetics is less interested in traditional questions like is this text beautiful? What is its historical context? What is its final meaning? Instead, it focuses on how meaning is created in the mind of the reader. This approach has some disadvantages. It gives us a deeper understanding of how reading works and how literature affects us mentally and emotionally. It also connects literary studies with scientific research, making it more interdisciplinary. However, there are also some drawbacks. Cognitive analysis can become very technical and detailed, sometimes focusing on much on mental processes that it ignores the literary qualities of the text. For example, analyzing every sentence in terms of figure and ground can become repetitive and tiring for readers. Some critics also question whether cognitive poetics really adds new insights to literary interpretation. They argue that many of its conclusions could be reached in simpler ways without using complex scientific terminology. Another issue is that cognitive poetics sometimes shifts attention away from literature itself and towards the study of the mind. This raises an important question: should literary studies focus more on text or on cognitive processes? Cognitivists argue that the two are inseparable, but not everyone agrees. Despite these criticisms, cognitive poetics remains an interesting and growing field. It offers a new way of thinking about literature, not just as a cultural or artistic product, but as an activity that involves the human mind in complex ways. Cognitive poetics tries to explain how we read, think, and feel when we engage with literature. It brings together ideas from language, psychology, and neuroscience to explore the mental processes behind reading. While it may not replace traditional methods of literary analysis, it provides a valuable new perspective that helps us better understand both literature and the human mind.